Good afternoon, everybody, and for some people, good morning. Yeah. Today we have truly international audience. I can see person from New Zealand, Philippines, India, US, yeah, many other countries, and we expect more people when things are moving. This is the first online English Marx school. We had Marx school in the last 3-4 months in Sinhala. So we have decided to have English Marx school at least once a month. And we are fortunate today to have Michael Roberts as our first speaker in the Marx school. Michael Roberts is a renowned Marxist economist. And I found he used to work in the city of London for over 30 years. So he must be very well aware about the logic and inner dynamic of the city. He's a prolific writer, author of The Great Recession, written in 2009, The Long Depression, published in 2016, and this small book, Marx, to commemorate 200th birth anniversary of Karl Marx. And at the moment, he's working on another book on Friedrich Engels, because his 200th birthday is due in November 2020. I thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And without further ado, I invite Michael to make his presentation. Michael Roberts.
Thank you, Sinani. I'm very happy to be here to discuss with you internationally in these extraordinary circumstances where we now operate by discussion online through webinars. In some ways, this, of course, is a setback. We never get to meet each other physically. But one big advantage of this is it seems to have allowed us to develop and express ideas and discuss ideas internationally through this method in the most effective way. So instead of me having to travel thousands of miles to meet you all in South Asia, I can do this sitting back in the southern part in the summertime, and hopefully we'll still be able to have a good discussion about what is going on in the world at the moment. I've been asked to speak really on the state of world capitalism in this year of the COVID pandemic, and also with some reference to what is happening to Sri Lanka and its economy and so on in the aftermath of your recent general election. Now, to do that, I want to be able to share to you some graphs, so I'm hoping I'll be able to do that. Sometimes the host is in control. Yes, the host is in control. He has to release that, so I can do that. And so is that okay now?
I just made you a co-host, so you can...
yeah, I got it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll just... Right, okay. Well, let me just start by the first thing. This presentation will just go through, first of all, the nature of the COVID pandemic to begin with, just to remind us what happened at the beginning of this year, then to deal with the state of the world economy before the pandemic hits. Because as I want to argue, that's very important for us to understand the strength of the world economy, world capitalist economy, before COVID came. Then to deal with the impact of the pandemic, and then to discuss after that what is happening as we come out of this, the lockdowns around the world, although that's not even completed yet. the impact that it's going to have, how long lasting it is, and in particular how it's affecting one of the so-called emerging economies or developing economies like Sri Lanka. So let's just remind ourselves that what we have here, COVID-19, is yet another virus which has appeared, new viruses. They're influenza type viruses like SARS and so on in the past, but we now have a new one. We've had several over the last particularly 20, 30 years. And what's the important development in these viruses is that they're coming from the pathogens incorporated into wildlife in remote areas of the world, and they've been spreading through from of pathogens from that wildlife, bats and other animals, into animals which are in the markets of human beings, in the cities and so on. And then eventually jumping across from animals to human beings. This is a particularly new development. And it's a result, and I think this is important to note, the result of what has happened to capitalism over the last 100 years. The insatiable drive towards profit globally, the globalisation of the world economy, the expansion in fossil fuel production, exploration, logging throughout the world, mineral exploitation, and urbanisation has driven the more remote parts of the world. They got smaller and smaller and less remote from human beings. And as a result, pathogens which are been inside these wild animals who are more or less immune to have jumped across into farm animals and eventually into humans. So into the markets of the urban areas, we've now got the development of these pathogens which have turned into serious damaging germs to human beings' bodies, similarly to what happened to the American indigenous peoples when Europeans arrived there. Europeans brought with them diseases that American peoples were not immune to, and killed 90% of the American indigenous peoples over the next 50 or 60 years. The conquistadores may have crushed people militarily and so on, and enslaved people, but actually the biggest killer in the Americas was disease. And here is another development now. These diseases are striking back into humans as we've expanded the world economy in this most uncontrolled, unenvironmentally harmonious to nature way which capitalism has developed through things like wildlife markets, but also industrial farming in general. And this particular COVID virus we must recognize is a very serious one. Now, some people have argued it's just like a flu, just like another flu. It is an influenza-style flu, but far as we can see, it is much more infectious, something like 2 or 3 times more infectious than the average annual flu that affects particularly Northern Hemisphere countries. It is incubating for a much longer time. That means that it can hang around there and cause damage to people and make them ill for a much longer period than influenza. It tends to put a lot more people into hospital, and now we know once hospitalized, they can have lasting damage on their lungs and heart systems and other things, even if they don't die. But also the fatality rate of COVID-19 is significantly higher than average flu. Average flu is about 0.1% of people who get it die, 0.1%, that's all, or less. In the case of COVID, as far as we can see, the death rate is around 3% now, but eventually, once if it ever gets exhausted, it'll probably be around 0.5 to 1% of people who catch it will die. So that is about 6 to 10 times more severe than average flu. We also now know it concentrated mainly in older people, those over 65, but also people who have got existing medical complaints. So if you're already sick and you're already in hospital and you're already needing medication, this COVID virus is likely to really kill you. And so it's concentrated in these people, less in young people and children, and more of these people, the sick and infirm, the people who need most support from the hospital system, face the biggest danger from this particular disease. And this is not new. This is the most important point. We must remember that these COVID-type influenza viruses, pathogens, have been predicted for some time to start to spread through human beings around the world in epidemics and pandemics. Only 20 years ago, there was a meeting of the leading epidemiologists and others to discuss whether there'd be an international epidemic, and they said there was every chance that we get a new disease, disease X they called it, that would spread and hit the cities of the world just much more seriously than Ebola, for example, did in Africa, because it was mainly in rural areas. And people should be prepared. Health systems, governments should be prepared for the unexpected. Only last September, the UN, which has a global monitoring unit looking at the dangers of epidemics and pandemics, warned that preparation was seriously weak in terms of the dangers of a new pandemic. And national leaders needed to respond to these dangers that are going to come with properly robust health systems, preparing drugs to meet the danger, building up resources and so on for the risk that was going to happen. That risk warning by the UN monitoring body was totally ignored by nearly all governments around the world. The only governments that didn't ignore it were those that had already been affected by pandemics or epidemics before in Asia, certain Asian countries, SARS and so on. So the health systems in, say, like Taiwan, Korea and so on, were much more better prepared and robust. But the vast majority of health systems were completely unable to prepare for the dangers which result from the influx of seriously sick people into hospitals, let alone those who are dying. There's now been a study done which shows that the more privatized the health system was in a country, the more the pandemic hit it hardest. The most well-organized public health systems that had plenty of capacity, plenty of nursing and doctoral staff, and had the right protection equipment were able to cope with this pandemic better, but the vast majority were unable to do that. And then, of course, the other horrible thing was that as it affected old people in particular, because of the complete destruction and decimation over the last 30 years of social care systems, that's for the elderly and demented and so on, these people were vulnerable, very highly vulnerable to death and serious illness from this pathogen, and yet nothing was done to protect them in any way. I can speak that from experience in the UK, the absolutely scandalous situation where we have the highest rate of deaths per million in Europe, or in the world almost, and most of those deaths have been concentrated in the social care area where nothing had been done to protect people. But that is the situation. So the first thing to say is that this pandemic was not a bolt out of the blue. It's not something exogenous to the economic system. It's a product of the economic system in the sense that it brought us closer to pathogens that are really dangerous. And it's a product of the capitalist system because we have cut and destroyed health systems so they're not robust, not in a position to deal with this pandemic and future pandemics. And they're still not in a position to do this. So that those two factors tell us that this is a product much more that is endogenous to the capitalist system than something that's coming out of the sky like an asteroid. And the other reason that it's not exogenous is that the world economy itself was in no state to handle this without going into a serious slump. Now, it's been my argument in my book, The Long Depression, and in general, is that particularly since the end of the Great Recession in 2009, the world economy has been in what I call a depression. And what does that mean? Well, if you look at the top right-hand corner of this graphic, you can see what is a sort of reverse square root. So what you get in a depression is something different from what you get in a recession. On the left-hand corner, you can see that's the usual recession. You go down in a slump, and capitalism has a slump, which it has on a regular basis every 10 or so years, particularly in the post-war period in the major economies. You go down for 2 or 3 percentage points, then you come back, and you can continue on the trend before. That's what happened in 74. Could be like 80, 82 and have a W slump, a W shape in the recovery. But now, since 2009, we've really been in a depression. Yes, you go down, then there's a recovery, but it's not to the same level of growth rate. The growth rate is now lower. into a new trajectory, which is much lower. And that's why I call it a depression. That sort of trajectory or period of time where you don't recover to the previous levels of growth anymore, and you enter a series of slumps, maybe. It started in the 19th century and in the 1930s, and in this period has also been the same. So already the pre-pandemic capitalist economy was weak. Although it had been the longest expansion since in the post-war period for a country like the US and other ones, from 2009, it's also been the weakest expansion since 2009, as that's been the weakest expansion of all the post-war recoveries from recessions. And you can see generally, capitalist growth has been declining, particularly over the last 30 years from previous trend growth rates. You can see China has had a growth rate that's been relatively high. This is a long-term 6-10 year rolling growth rate, but all the others are falling as well, and even China is beginning to fall. So even before we get to the pandemic itself, world economies were slowing down, they were growing weakly, investment was low, and as I will show you later, profitability was low. So you can see on the left-hand side here of this graph, the trajectory before, in the past period, was the dark black line there. Then you go into a lower trajectory from about 2000, and then with the Great Recession, the blue line shows you an even further lower trajectory. The same applies with the right-hand graph, which also shows something similar. You get the general trajectory of the growth since 1970 to 2007 in per capita terms. Then we enter the Great Recession, and the recovery, the actual growth rate after that is way below the trend growth rate that had previously existed. And then right on the end there on that right-hand graph is Goldman Sachs' forecast for where the world economy was going to drop during this pandemic. So you can see that it would drop down to the levels in terms of real GDP per capita that we haven't seen since really the beginning of this century. So the pandemic is wiping out 20 years of improvements in living standards, or at least in GDP per head, that experienced over the last 20 years. And perhaps the other factor about the pre-pandemic is that there's been a general collapse in investment, particularly productive investment. This looks at the average OECD economy, the investment rate as a percentage of GDP, net of all the investment that goes in just to replace worn out capital and so on. So this is the extra bit to take economies forward further from where they were before. And you can see that gradually there's been a fall, particularly in the early 2000s, but onwards in the productive investment being made by capitalists across the major economies. And then we have the pandemic, which you see is a dramatic slump going down to something like an investment rate now of 2% or even lower as a percentage of GDP. The world economy was already slowing down in investment rate, and then the pandemic hits it again. This is obviously the most important graph in my view, because behind a slowdown in investment, behind a slowdown in growth and trade, lies a slowdown in the capitalist's ability to increase profits, in particular profits relative to how much they're investing or their stock of capital. This is the measure for the G7 economies of the rate of return on capital for the top 7 capitalist economies over the last 70 years. And we can see on the left-hand side that it used to have a reasonable growth rate, reasonable rate of profit, of 10 or 11% in the golden age. Then we had this major profitability crisis from the mid-60s to the early 1980s, and then the so-called neoliberal recovery, which I haven't got time to go into, but we can discuss, which led to some relative improvement in profitability. But since the late 1990s, we've entered a depressed position for profitability. The long depression is expressed above all in a low level of profitability and a continuing fall one. And now we have the pandemic. This is the G20 as a whole, same sort of graph. As you can see, that since 1998, there's been a falling rate of profit, a relatively low rate of profit in the top 20, or to be more exact, 19 economies in the world, but the 20th is the Eurozone as a whole. So we can see that the rate of profit there has also followed the same trajectory. And if we just look at some of the key so-called emerging markets, we see an even bigger fall in the period in the 60s and 70s into the early 80s, a limited recovery in the rate of profit there, and then a general fall back again to lows. So some of the key so-called emerging economies, including China, including India, including Indonesia, the overall rate of profit is very, very low. This puts the world economy in a weak position to deal with any major hit to the ability to sustain production and investment. And in fact, if we look at the US, we find that generally profits, we read about huge profits that are being made by US companies, but it's heavily concentrated in the tech companies, the so-called FANGs, Facebook, Alphabet, Apple, Netflix, etc. These companies, these big tech companies have been making huge profits. But if you strip them out of the equation, then profit growth in the rest of the companies, even in the United States and also in Europe, is more or less flat. It's not really been improving much at all. So there's a profits crisis for the majority of companies in the major economies and a profitability slump. Investment was low, and then we get the pandemic. And that meant there are loads of companies in most economies who were just making enough profits to cover the cost of servicing the debt and the borrowing that they've been conducting over the last 15, 20, 30 years. These companies are often called zombie companies. In other words, they just survive sufficiently to pay their workers and pay their debt, but they can't expand, they can't develop investments and new technology. They just struggle along at this level. And then these constitute something like 20 to 25% among all the economies in the major companies in all the major economies, particularly smaller companies, of course. And the reason for that has been a reason that they've even just been able to maintain a level of growth and investment and expansion in the corporate sector is because of the massive increase in corporate debt. Corporations have borrowed huge amounts of money. The very rich companies have been doing so in order to not spend their cash, but to borrow at a cheap rate, stock up their profits abroad to avoid in tax havens. But the very small companies have been forced to borrow in order to survive. So we see a sharp rise in corporate debt. I'd like to emphasize, we hear a lot about public sector debt. We hear a lot about maybe financial debt, but this is the non-financial corporate sector debt. Crucial, it seems to me, to the ability of capitalism to work. And we can see that it's been rising not only in the world, not only in the mature markets, but also in the 30 top developing markets as well. And that, most of all in the corporate sector, we've seen the position of emerging market corporations in severe difficulties in terms of the level of debt that they're building up. So when you want to measure that increase in debt against the increase in the productivity, increase in output per unit of debt, you can see it's been falling dramatically across the world. So more debt, not enough production or productivity created by that extra borrowing. So the increasing weight of debt upon the ability of these corporations to invest and progress. They're not making enough profit, and the production is not enough to compensate for the huge increase in debt. And then the other factor that we've seen prior, this is all prior to the pandemic, is a significant slowdown in world trade. As you can see in the period before the Great Recession, world trade was growing at something like 6% a year, faster even than world GDP, which was around about 4 to 5% a year. But since the Great Recession, it's been growing at 2% or even less a year. World growth has slowed down, but it was actually world trade growth has been no faster anymore than world GDP growth, if not slower. That means if you're an economy that finding it difficult to expand your own market and you want to export abroad, and that applies probably to most developing economies, then where you used to be able to escape because world trade was growing faster than your own economy, you could export and make gains that way. Now the situation has been reversed. Really, it's the end of globalisation. If you look at that blue line, you can see it's been flattening out since the end of the Great Recession. There's been no rise in trade openness. That means the amount of investment, amount of exports and imports as a share of GDP. You can see the huge globalization period during the neoliberal period, which helped capitalism to develop and globalize. That process has come to an end now because of the weakness of the world economies, particularly in the last 10 to 15 years. And I would say that the recession was coming by the end of 2019 anyway. This is a measure of the major countries' corporate profits growth, 5 or 6 major countries which have been weighted. And you can see that there have been periods when profits growth actually goes negative, so profits fall overall. This is not profitability, not profits per capital, but profits in total. You can see that it's gone into negative periods. That's when a crisis comes. And at the end of 2019, that's exactly what was happening again. We were heading into a world recession anyway before the pandemic. The pandemic, of course, has accelerated that. And that brought us the pandemic. And I'd say, first of all, on the point about lockdown and that exclamation mark, did we need lockdowns? I hear a lot of debate, particularly in Western countries, about whether we needed a lockdown or not. And the answer to the question is, if a government had a decent health service with plenty of resources, if there'd been medicines in place, if there'd been protective equipment in place, if there'd been mass testing capability in order to isolate and quarantine people who caught this virus, and that you could protect the most vulnerable in society, then probably you wouldn't have needed a lockdown. But virtually no country was able to do that. So they were either faced with the alternative of going for absolutely drastic repressive lockdowns, which is what China did, in order to keep it down to a short period of time before they could release it, or to less levels of repressive lockdowns, which meant that you spread out and increased the number of infections and deaths that you've got. The most extreme on the relaxed side in the West has been Sweden, which has ended up with just as many deaths as the ones that have locked down, if not more per head, and yet has not avoided a collapse in its economy, just like the others. So the lockdowns probably were necessary given the situation that the capitalist health systems were in. But what happened with the weak economies that we see, and you can see these 2 red lines here, the red line and the blue line, for emerging economies were already slowing down, and then we got in their economic indicators, and then when the pandemics come, it's tipped the world economy over a cliff. And now we have a position, an unprecedented position, where nearly over 90% of the economies in the world that we can record are in recession. We've never had such a level of recession, never had such a global recession, not even the 2008-9 matches this in the size of the global impact of this recession. A number of economies in recession. The Great Depression of the 1930s had over 80%. Now we're talking about 93% of economies in recession as a result of the pandemic. And perhaps even more staggering is that the so-called developing economies, which in most world slumps continues to grow at some level, not enough to compensate for their population growth usually in the recessions, but generally they grow at 2, 3, 4, 5% a year on average. It depends, because that average includes China and India and so on. But for the first time, we can say since records began looking for developing economies growth, that the pandemic has pushed them into a slump on average, including China, including India, including Indonesia, including the faster growth emerging economies. They're all going into a slump this year. This year we'll see a contraction in GDP. And global unemployment is rocketing. The International Labour Organization reckons that we could probably be talking about a loss of income for workers of something like $3.5 trillion as a result of the pandemic, and possibly 200 million people losing their jobs which otherwise they would have had. And it's now estimated that something like 500 million people will be thrown back into poverty. By that we mean the contraction in their incomes will force people who otherwise would have just about cleared the World Bank's pathetically low poverty line. They will not clear that now. And others will drop back below that level, so that we could have an increase in the number of poor people as measured by $5.50 per day as a measurement of poverty line, an extra 500 million people in that. So nearly 4 billion people, by that definition, are in poverty level. And contrast that with the fact that the stock market in the US and elsewhere are rocketing to new records day by day. Why has that happened? Because what has happened is, in order for to keep the financial sector going, the banks going, keep companies going, central banks around the world, particularly the Fed, but others too, have ploughed in huge amounts of liquidity injections in terms of loans, in terms of zero interest rate loans, and even, and above all, by purchasing all sorts of bonds and debt held by companies and other institutions, not just companies, in order to sustain these companies during the pandemic. That has meant people feel, investors, the rich investors feel they've got nothing to worry about for the price of their companies, the stocks that they own, and so they've ploughed in as well to boost the stock prices as a result. So you can see that the Federal Reserve's asset, which is the red line, is increased by several $1 trillion in such a short period of time, and after the initial shock, the S&P stock market has rapidly recovered and gone beyond its previous level in chasing the Fed's largesse. Also, there's been a massive increase in fiscal spending. We have never seen this level of government spending over and above what revenues they receive across the board. Anything between 11% of GDP in fiscal packages in some of the countries like Denmark and Singapore, and even most countries, even those poorer ones, have been able to do that. On average, something like 4 to 5% of GDP has been spent by governments to try and keep their economies going. That's just twice as high as happened during the Great Recession and the attempt to sustain economies then. So a massive monetary injection, a massive fiscal spend, but has it enabled economies to survive? We have a huge deficit now, something like 25 to 30 trillion across the board in most global economies, equivalent to 30% of global GDP in 1 year has been ploughed in terms of trying to maintain economies by governments and central banks, driving up the public sector debt to well over 100% of GDP. It was already rising since the Great Recession ended, but now it's going to be, by the end of this, something like 130% of GDP in the advanced economies, and even the emerging market economies, which have lower public debt to GDP, are also shooting up as well. So there's going to be a huge debt overhang as a result of this expenditure. And that means that debt servicing costs will rise, even if interest rates are very, very low, which they are. If you have a bigger amount of debt, you're going to have to pay more interest. So the ratio of interest to the tax revenues that governments are getting is rising steadily, and will rise even further as we go for the next few years. It had been falling because of falling interest rates. Now we're going to see a rise. So that means that if a government's got a budget, increasingly a large percentage of it will have to be spent on paying back interest to the owners of government bonds that have been purchased, which is partly the central banks themselves, but also the private sector, the corporate sector and so on, holding those bonds. So that uses up money that otherwise could have been used into restoring the health service, boosting public services. So it's a real damage to the ability of governments to help the population and provide services. Unemployment is going to rise dramatically. It already is. Employment under the pandemic has fallen by anything between 45 and 25% across the board. Some people are going back to work now, but we're going to see levels of unemployment at least 10% in the major advanced economies for several years ahead, which is going to seriously damage not only the conditions for workers and so on, but also make it very difficult for economies to grow. In this pandemic, we started off with a supply shock, with the lockdown, so everything stopped, production stopped, 30 to 40% of production stopped. Then we had a demand shock, because if people are sent home, they don't have enough money, or they're not prepared to spend it because they're not going out. There's a huge demand shock. So all those sectors of the economy which depend upon people spending money, travel, tourism, entertainment and so have just been decimated by this. The airlines are decimated, tourism is decimated, which we'll come to in a moment. And that has had a tremendous effect. But one thing we haven't had yet is a financial collapse. But that is the real danger on the third stage. Bankruptcies are on the rise. Many, many companies are never going to be seen again. They're closed down forever. Other ones are struggling on for several months. But unless they get continual largesse from their central banks or from other places, all that means is building up debt, then they're likely to enter a serious level of bankruptcies. You can see on this graph on the right-hand side, increase in bankruptcies, and the number is already picking up to the levels we saw in the Great Recession, and we're at early days on this. So the financial, a whole range of corporates going bust is a real danger, including big ones, and that can hit the banks as well. The banks apparently now have made $130 billion worth of provisions in preparation for company and corporate defaults next year. That brings me to little old Sri Lanka. Briefly, I just wanted to discuss how the impact of the pandemic is on Sri Lanka, particularly after the election. I don't need to tell you, those of you who live there will know it better than me, that it's a relatively small country by Asian standards, 22 million. Its per capita GDP is around about $4,000, which puts it at the lower end of scale amongst developing economies. And yet we had a result here in this election, which shows that the SFLPA, led by the two brothers, has massively won the election with 59% of the vote, 145 seats, and with the help of some others down there on the right-hand corner, it will probably have enough to get a 2/3 majority in Parliament to enable it to carry out measures to strengthen its position to remain in power for the foreseeable future. The opposition, whether of a more liberal nature or of any socialist nature, if that's there, has been decimated by this result. And the new Parliament shows the strength of the new alliance backed by the military of the two brothers' presidency and prime ministership. The Sri Lankan economy has been moving from a rural economy towards an more urbanized one around manufacturing and services rather slowly. It's supposedly got better social indicators than in South Asia, with poverty much lower than elsewhere, but that's really a bit of a misnomer, because although it may have less people under the World Bank poverty level as a percentage of the population, it has a very large layer of people just above that level who really in a position of being poor by any international standards. The inequality in Sri Lanka is particularly high. Here is a graph you can see on the left-hand side that the share of household income of the poorest 10% of households is less than 2%, while the richest 10% have earnings equivalent to 38% of household income in Sri Lanka. And if you look on the right-hand side, the inequality measure, the Gini index, puts Sri Lanka, the change in it that we've seen over the last 30 years, as one of the highest. Sri Lanka has become more unequal than it's ever. Its Gini rate is 40%, which is pretty high. Well, there are other countries that are higher, but the inequality increase in Sri Lanka is one of the highest amongst all those countries listed there. It's the concentration of poor around 1 million, just above the poverty line, means that there are around 2.5 million, if you include the families as a whole, in some form of poverty or near poverty in Sri Lanka as a whole. And that puts it well down the list in the standards of trying to deal with poverty, particularly amongst the old. If you look on the right-hand side, the retired, the old and the disabled are the poorest of all in Sri Lanka. If we look at the immediate position of Sri Lanka when the pandemic hit it, you can see that the economy was slowing down quite significantly. Growth rates, which had been around 3, 4, 5% in the past, had slipped away and went virtually down to under 2% or below, or heading, before we get to the pandemic, we're heading towards a recession. Sri Lanka was in a serious position before 2020 with growth rates at 1% or below. And the employment rate, which had also started to deteriorate over the last 5 years, where it had been relatively high, most people had some form of employment, informal mostly, of course, was taking a hit in the last year before the pandemic came along. And youth unemployment, which had been horrifically high back in the 1990s and supposedly improved up until the Great Recession of 2008-9, has gradually been rising again in the period since then, even though the wars and civil wars had come to an end in the latter part of this last decade. And now we've seen a collapse actually since the events of the attacks and the war before. Tourist arrivals have been drastically reduced anyway. And although there appeared to be some possibility of improvement this year, now we have had the pandemic has hit again tourism. And tourism is very important for Sri Lanka, and it's now a complete disaster. So the result is that inequality of income in Sri Lanka and low growth and weakening employment means that the government doesn't get much revenues. The rich don't pay tax in Sri Lanka. And because they're not taxed, the only tax form comes really from sales tax, VAT and other things, which the government cut recently, which provides most of the revenues. And that requires economic activity, and that's down. So we've got low fiscal revenues combined with big expenditures on salary and interest payments, which I talked about before. And that means that the ability of the government to provide public services, boost staff in order to deliver that, is drastically reduced. And then, of course, there's military spending. A huge chunk of the Sri Lankan government budget goes on military spending, the buttress for the current government and for governments over the last 15 years. You can see the size of military spending has not declined at all, really, over the last 20 years in Sri Lanka. This means that the government debt is now hit over 85% of GDP, which is very high for an emerging economy. It puts a lot of burden on the government in debt servicing and the ability to use any of their revenues for productive resources. And now we have the pandemic, where industrial production, already close to zero in growth just before the pandemic, has plummeted by 50%, a small recovery since. So the industry is completely on its knees. Tourism has been destroyed, at least for a period of time. The government has no revenues. It's in a serious situation. The result of that has been a dramatic fall in the rupee against other currencies. This is against the dollar. We've never seen such highs. It's fallen low, but it's a high relative to the dollar. Number of rupees per dollar has shot up. It's been rising anyway, but now it's reached a new level in 2020. This means that everything is now dependent upon how is the Sri Lankan's fiscal deficit to be met, with debt levels already likely to surpass 100% of GDP this year, foreign reserves down. How are we going to meet the debt repayments? The answer is almost certainly that the new government will have to extend the fund facility with the IMF, and it will have to introduce measures which the IMF wants rather than what the government wants, if it wants that money to get through this next period of the pandemic without a complete collapse of the currency. Basically, says this particular securities advisor, you need a 3-year moratorium with creditors on restructuring our debt. Well, the chances of that are limited. Argentina have just managed to get that, but most private sector creditors are refusing any restructuring, and the IMF and the World Bank is limited to simply reducing interest rates on debt that they offer. A 3-year moratorium is what's needed at the very least, and that's most unlikely to happen. Finally, Chair and everybody else, I just want to deal with the situation in the world economy in this period as we come out of the pandemic. I call it a scarring. Such a depth of recession and slump, such a length and spread of this slump means that it have permanent damage to the world capitalist economy. Here's the estimate of the IMF. You can see a line going through where they thought there would be growth, the real GDP growth, that's that top line. Then we get the pandemic to this summer we just hit. Now we get a new trajectory, but all that blue shaded area is permanent income loss. It's never coming back. And it will continue to be lost until the bottom blue line reaches the top blue line, and that doesn't seem likely for some time. There will be no V-shaped recovery because 90% of the world already in recession. So synchronized recession. That means that if one economy starts to come out of the recession, which China has been doing over the last few months, it's very difficult for it to grow very much if the rest of the world economy is still in a slump, because its trade and exports will not expand very much and there won't be much purchases for it. So given the size of this slump and the spread of it, it means that there are attempts by every government to protect themselves against each other rather than to internationally cooperation. There's no international cooperation in trying to come out of this slump. And we see that productive investment, as I said earlier, is at all-time lows, and that we've seen one of the largest declines will take ages to recover. And the additional debt that I talked about earlier is now even rising even further, which makes it very difficult to expand productive investment when you've got all that debt to cover. And the COVID pandemic is not over. This is the case in India and other parts of Asia, that the number of infections are rising, not falling. You can see on this graph that the biggest, most important capitalist economy in the world, the US, infections are continuing to run higher and higher uncontrollably. So the pandemic is not over. We have no clear vaccine that can be presented to solve the problem. We don't have sufficient medicines to deal with people severely ill. So it's every possibility that hospitals will be overloaded again as this virus continues to spread across the world. And as I say, if that means that lockdowns continue longer, then there's no possibility of opening up international trade, with travel held back, with value price chains blocked. Then we can see further falls in the trade levels. Here is a measure of merchandise trade by the World Trade Organization. It used to be the blue dotted line. Then after the Great Recession, it was the yellow dotted line, the trajectory. And now as we enter this COVID, we can see we could be as low as levels the red line, so that trade growth will have fallen from levels of around 130 on this index to 90. And they'll be back at levels we haven't seen since for the last 10 or 12 years. That's the situation of trade, which can continue for the future. A permanent scarring then, where you get a long-term expansion rate way below where it has before, and it can't be restored, says the IMF. We used to argue as Marxists that capitalism gets out of its crises by laying off workers, closing down old companies that aren't productive anymore, merging companies, so the ones that are leaner and fitter have a higher profit rate and then can re-expand and take on workers again. So you get a cycle of boom and slump. This process of the leaner and fitter companies getting rid of the older and weaker ones at our expense of unemployment, of course, meant that they could then introduce new technologies that weren't around before. And there are plenty of new technologies around. The question is this form of boom and slump, creative destruction, likely to happen now? The economist Joey Schumpeter, who was an Austrian economist, thought that slumps kill off inefficient monopolies and allow smaller innovative firms to flourish. Well, clearly that's not the case if we consider the fangs of America as being the monopolies, the tech monopolies. They are flourishing, not the smaller companies at the moment. Marx said it would kill off the weak and small, which is certainly true, and allow the more efficient and large to consolidate. Well, that may well be true, but there's still an awful lot of weak and small who are holding on with the money that have been offered by central banks and by fiscal support, these zombie companies. So it doesn't seem that the process of creative destruction is there yet, the Marxist version at least. So in that situation, we could crawl along in this depressed state for some time ahead with these low trajectories, which I show below there. So instead of that green line trajectories we had before, we enter a series of lower trajectories as a result of the pandemic and the difficulty of getting out. The head of the UN, Secretary General Antonio Guterres, said recently, and I think it was a staggering statement, I've got to tell you all, you've got to read this. He said that the pandemic is like an X-ray revealing the fractures in the fragile skeleton of societies we have built. So he says this exposes, the pandemic has exposed what's wrong with capitalism anyway. It's exposing fallacies and falsehoods everywhere. The lie that free markets can deliver health care for all. How true. The fiction that unpaid care work is not work. Yes. the delusion that we live in a post-racist world. Well, how can you say that after the events of the last few months? The myth that we're all in the same boat, clearly not, when we look at the big tech companies and their profits and the $500 million going back into poverty. Now is the time for global leaders, says Guterres, to decide, are we going to succumb to chaos, division and inequality, or will we right the wrongs of the past and move forward together for the good of all? Well, I think we could answer that question by saying, no, it's not going to happen under capitalism. And all those pre-pandemic problems are now going to be worse. The big challenges ahead for world capitalism, the rising inequality of income and wealth, it's going to get worse. Poverty is going to get worse, according to Philip Alston of the UN, who looks at poverty all the time. Half the world now, less than $5.50 a day, and the situation has not changed in the last 30 years. Global warming and climate change, now a 1 in 5 chance that we'll go above the danger level of 1.5 degrees warmer than pre-industrial times in the next 5 years. There's nothing being done to stop that. The environmental destruction, and therefore the more likely event of more pandemics to follow this one. And of course, perhaps the big geopolitical issue, the growing tension between US as the leading hegemonic imperialist power and its rival China that threatens US interests, and the growing political and technical and maybe even worse form of struggle over the next 10 years. In my view, these are the issues that face us ahead, and the pandemic has failed to, has exposed them in very big ways. That's it, Simone.
Professor Lenig, I think you have to unmute the microphone.
Thank you, Mike, for your presentation. And now I'll invite the
I know
others.
it was too long, Samani, but there you go.
No, it's done very, 50 minutes. Normally, our format is 45 to 60 minutes presentation, and then to have a discussion. So you used only 50 minutes, I think that's fine.
Far too long.
Yeah, I will ask others to respond, asking questions, making comments, and even making your own observations. Thank you. Who is going to?
Somebody better ask a question, or I'll do another 50 minutes.
Right. Oh, yeah. Marty Goodman.
Marty, you have to unmute the microphone.
Unmute the microphone.
Off on the left.
Oh, got it. Now we can hear you.
Here we go.
Right.
I have a very basic question. In the United States, I don't know, 30, 40 million people are out of work. And they're talking about a second wave coming up. And in the South and Southwest, it's out of control, COVID. I come from South Florida. I just lost 2 friends. Another friend is on a ventilator. How is it possible? Is it possible for capitalism to survive? That's the big question. I wonder what you think of that, if that's a reasonable question.
It's a very reasonable question. Do you want me to answer one at a time or a few at a time?
However you wish.
Well, I'm not in charge. What does Samani think?
Yeah, you can answer that question, and then we will. Next question will be from Ridley.
Okay. Well,
Goodman's question.
It's a very reasonable question, but it's a very difficult one to answer. Will capitalism survive is the question that we're always discussing behind our heads when we had these meetings. Does the COVID pandemic create such a crisis for capitalism that it's going to collapse? And the example you give is the fact that it's uncontrolled, the pandemic in the US. People are dying, people are catching this disease, people are suffering severe results from it, being hospitalized for months and so on. And yet the governments the federal administration, at least, and many states administrations are ignoring this. They want to carry on as though nothing had happened, and they hope that it will go away, and that even if it doesn't go away, they don't really care if the old and the sick and even some younger people die as a course of this, as long as capitalism gets on with what it's supposed to do, which is make money and employ and exploit people to do so. But can they go on doing that? Well, I think the first thing to say is that clearly the economies of the United States and elsewhere are not going to come out of this slump very quickly. As you point out, there are 40 million people, Americans at the moment, unemployed in some form. Even if those come back from furlough, and we now have a position where they're not even getting extra funds while Congress debates that to survive. So there's going to be huge numbers of people unemployed, particularly those in the worst jobs and the lowest paid jobs, who are the ones that are going to suffer the most. In that situation, the economy is going to be weak. There's not going to be sufficient growth and prosperity. That must increase the political tensions in the US, which are already reaching a certain height, will now be expressed in a presidential election in November. And we might want to ask ourselves, does it make any difference what happens in that election? Well, I think maybe what it does make a difference is to see whether there's any sort of change in the views of Americans, particularly young Americans, during the course of this campaign over the next 3 months, whoever wins, in terms of policies to deal with the crisis. The Democrats have no better policies than Trump does, apart from having a more acceptable policies for big business and Wall Street, probably, than the erratic Trump. But even so, they're not intending to do anything about really either controlling the COVID pandemic with proper public health policies, with a single care Medicare system, nothing like that. They're not going to support working people through state and public investment in any effective way. I looked at Biden's program, there's nothing about increasing public services through state investment, nothing. All that they're interested in doing is trying to support during the pandemic and then returning to the position as before. So in my view, nothing's going to turn this economy around, except capitalism can always turn itself around, even in this slump at the end of the day, if there's no political action to change the nature of capitalism. So the short answer to your question, unless people move into action to try and get rid of capitalism through political and industrial struggle, then capitalism will eventually get out of this crisis. It's not going to collapse into medieval society as a result of the COVID. People will die. The infections will possibly eventually wane. Eventually we'll get a vaccination in 6 months, 12 months, which will help to some extent ameliorate this particular pandemic. And then economies will gradually come out, as I argue, at a much lower level. But if nothing happens politically to change that, then we will still have the same regime.
Okay, thanks. Ridley?
Yes, Michael, very interesting your talk about this pandemic situation and the economy and the politics. Now, my question is to you is about politically. If you were, I know you're not a capitalist, but if you were thinking as a capitalist economist, politically, what kind of leadership or a form of state would you require to come out of this situation, right? That's the first question. The second is, if you are an anti-capitalist, what are your prospects of fighting this situation, and what are your prospects in that situation?
Well, good question again. You're saying on the one hand, what is the capitalist class? What operation, what organization and nature of the state do they want to have in order to deal with this crisis? And then what can labor and working people, what should be the way they organize and on what issues? There is some debate about whether democracy, as bourgeois democracy, which is the right to vote, the right to protest, the right even to strike, the right to have a free press, all these things that we have as rights, which had to be fought for over centuries by working people and poor people in the teeth of opposition from the ruling classes. These rights, which most of the countries of the advanced capitalist world still have, more or less, are these things that the capitalist state feels it has to get rid of now in order to impose its way in dealing with the COVID and the crisis. Well, I think there's always a faction, a sizable faction within the capitalist class that does look in that direction, who seeks to erode these rights and do away with them as best they can. And we know anyway that these rights are totally distorted. Take the US. You have the right to vote, as we do in the UK, but you have the right to vote once every 4 years or once every 2 years for the Congress. The only people who can stand have to be multi-billionaires, virtually, because you can't get on the ballot otherwise. Loads of people are deregistered by maneuvers by the states and so on. This is not pure, even on a level of voter democracy, it's not pure. It's completely distorted and run by big business lobbies and controlled by them through the media and so on. So this is an election for people to choose between two billionaires, usually. And that's the nature of the democratic process in the US. It's not much better in the UK, I can tell you. So the situation is that we don't really have that sort of pure democracy. But do the capitalists want to go further and just actually close that down, that level of democracy? Well, the answer to the question is always, if the capitalists think they don't need to do that and they can persuade enough people or ignore enough people to carry on with the policies they want, and they can just argue amongst themselves about what the right policies are, then we won't move to such an undemocratic regime. But there's a sizable section, particularly now in the advanced capitalist countries like the US, and in lots of other smaller capitalist economies like Turkey, India, so on, Sri Lanka, where there is definitely a faction who thinks that we don't even need that. If that's not going to work to get what we want, then we are prepared to do away with it. But that usually is in a moment of severe crisis when the workers are in action to change things. The capitalists then have to resort to military regime and doing away with democratic rights. We haven't reached that point yet. What can the workers do in this struggle? Sorry to a long answer. Two things. It seems to me that first, industrially, workers must defend the rights of the jobs and the conditions that they had before the pandemic. That's going to be a major struggle. Already, millions of workers are likely to lose their jobs. Their conditions are going to be reduced. There needs to be industrial struggle to defend. That's a defensive struggle. It's going to be difficult. But out of that defensive struggle can come new organizations and new militancy. And then there's the political side. It seems to me there's a tremendous opportunity politically for Labour now. What is the biggest thing that people will want? They will want a decent public health system that is free at the point of use, that can deal with pandemics and solve our health issues, and governments should be providing this. It's a basic human right that we have, that we don't have to die. We should have a health system with all the technology and resources that are involved to do that. So any government that opposes an expansion of a free public health system is going to lose a lot of support. And I think that's a powerful political program that we can present, and other public services as well. So on the Labour side, we must try to extend human rights beyond just the vote towards social rights like health, education, and so on. And we must be prepared for capitalism to resort to further measures to reduce democratic rights if they think they're coming under pressure.
Any other questions?
I think Amali had a question.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. You spoke about the central bank's initiatives to increase liquidity in the economies. So the Sri Lankan central bank also reduced rates and boosted access to credit, particularly for the business class and even small businesses. What are the likely scenarios that you foresee that Sri Lanka is going to encounter, especially since the economic growth is likely to slow down and there are few opportunities for the businesses to expand? Thanks.
Yes, well, I think the IMF and World Bank are forecasting that the Sri Lankan economy will contract by over 6% during 2020. I haven't looked at the records, but I think that must be one of the biggest falls, if not the biggest fall in 1 year for the Sri Lankan economy, at least in the post-war period. So this is a serious slump. As you say, the monetary authorities and the fiscal authorities of most governments, as I argued as well, have tried to compensate for this catastrophe by trying to help companies and businesses survive. One method, as you say, has been to cut interest rates to zero or close to zero. In the advanced capitalist countries, they're already pretty close to zero. In countries like Sri Lanka, they still have a positive rate, but have moved down. And also to start offering extended credit facilities. But this is more debt. This means that small businesses are going to be taking on more debt. It might be a low interest rate, but it's more debt. And unless there's a return to growth, unless there's a return to profitability for businesses, then they're going to be even more hamstrung than they were before in order to develop and invest and expand and employ more people and take the island forward economically. So I think it's a really, really difficult position. It's nowhere near enough fiscal support that can come from the Sri Lankan government under its own resources at the moment. And the central bank has a limited amount that it can also do, particularly if it has to, it will require the dollar swap support that it's getting from the Federal Reserve and elsewhere. All these central banks are getting the ability to exchange their local currencies for dollars, and that obviously helps credit for export and so on for Sri Lankan companies and so on, but it's all going to be very limited in its ability to take the Sri Lankan economy out of this slump. This situation means that almost inevitably there will have to be institutional credit support from the IMF in particular. The World Bank doesn't really provide very much. The IMF is going to have to step in. You already have a program here, but what the IMF terms means is basically the Sri Lankan government loses control of what it wants to do in its own national interests. What the two brothers might want to do about the Sri Lankan economy will actually be a question of negotiation with the IMF. And if there is no debt monitoring, and if there is no change in that, then either Sri Lanka faces two things, possibly both. One, a severe fiscal austerity, reduction in public services, more poverty for a whole period of time, and a very weak currency, if not weakening currency, which makes all dollar debt and all other possibilities for expansion of resources using foreign investment and so on be out of the window. It might increase tourism because Sri Lanka will look very cheap if it takes off. But as we can see, the question of tourism will not be decided by whether Sri Lankan hotels are charging hardly anything at all and so on, but whether people actually want to travel at all to foreign parts now as part of their leisure activity.
Right. Who's next? Okay. Jesse.
Can I ask a question?
Jesse,
Sorry?
you have to unmute.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah. This is from
Good
Philippines.
evening. Yeah, from the Philippines. I'm Jessie from the Philippines. Good evening, Michael. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the very enlightening
Can you hear?
talk.
Yeah.
Right. Carry on.
And I just would like to put forward that COVID also is being used by fascist leaders like our leader here in the Philippines to suppress human rights and suppress dissent and violate some human rights in our country. And also, I agree with you that the worst hit, the hardly hit sectors of the society are the poor and also the women, because of the feminization of poverty. And if poverty becomes wider, then a lot of women becomes poorer also. And if you look at the Southeast Asia and in the Philippines, the Philippines is performing very, very bad in terms of its economy during the COVID pandemic. Because when you look at our neighbors like Thailand and the other Southeast Asian countries, the economy, the GDP contracted to an average of 5-6%, negative 5-6%. But the Philippines, our GDP contracted, it fell down to negative 16. So, do you see any? My question is, do you see any relationship between the performance in terms of the economy and the kind of priority, the political priority of the leaders of the country? Like, for example, here in the Philippines, the priority of the government is to legislate the anti-terror law, and now they're looking at passing the death penalty, etc., etc., rather than addressing the health issues brought about by COVID and the economic issues that's brought about by the lockdowns and etc. So what do you think about that?
I think you're absolutely right. What we've seen is in some of the more reactionary governments, like the one you have in the Philippines, but also in India, also in Bolivia, and in Turkey. And we can list all these governments which have, you might call tin pot dictators, still might have some sort of an electoral system, but they rule with the backing of the military and with the big bourgeois. And as far as they're concerned, during this COVID pandemic, they see it as an opportunity to apply a reduction in human rights, as you've said, rather than to do anything about solving the health issues or the economy. Because the economies in these countries are in such bad state, and because the health systems are also in bad state, they use COVID as an excuse to actually apply other things which they think appeal to their political base, which is amongst the more petty bourgeois reactions and so on. So we have a growing tension between these very reactionary, pro-military, anti-democratic governments and the population at large, and which will, I don't know how this will unfold, but clearly the tensions are going to increase. We could see further coups from the right, removing democratic governments. Also, or we could see some of these military governments actually crack because they're unable to deliver anything on the economic or health front if this pandemic continues for some time. If you have a pandemic that continues for a long time, and the lockdowns continue, and the economies are weak and terrible, and poor people, as you say, poor people are usually women as well, in fact, mostly women, this is why we can see an intense conflict, it seems to me, between labour and capital through this political process over the next year or two. And it's not always going to be in the right direction, but sometimes it might. I'm just finish on, the more you add up the number of countries that have these reactionary governments, particularly in the developing world, the more you can see how they're getting more reactionary in the process of the COVID. And that demonstrates the increasing social and class tension that's going to exist in these countries, which is being generated by the pandemic.
Anybody? Kalpa?
Hello,
Thank you.
Oh.
Hello? Hello, I'm Ranjana.
Ranjan.
So, yeah.
He's from New Zealand.
Yeah.
Well, this is supposed to be the country's successful process in COVID. So.
Okay, Ranjana.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Robert. And I would like to ask this one. Throughout your whole seminar, actually, you explained the economic crisis affected by the pandemic around the world. Actually, it seems like to me, so far, it's not a political crisis that we can see around the world, especially in the Europe or in developed countries, because of the pandemic, and people get together to come out of this one, to go back where they were, not to go forward. So what are the possibilities of changing this system from capitalist to the next system, or how can we make the passage to go there? Otherwise, after coming out, if they are possible to come out from this pandemic, what capitalists would do is they would do more harmful things for the environment. They would do more exploitation from the poor people and try to make more and more profit. So is there any passage we can make as leftist view to go through to change the system into next stage, and any other possibilities or any other passage that we can use? Thank you.
Okay.
Oh, I wish I knew the answer. It is very difficult to see. If I knew, and we all knew, the correct program, strategy, and organizational tactics to adopt in order to bring a successful victory for labor over capital in one or many countries around the world, which could transform the position in this crisis, then it will be fantastic. All 30 of us listening to this will become leading world revolutionaries and transform the world. But it's not easy, is it, to work out what the strategy and tactics should be and how to organize. All this seminar, in a way, is trying to discuss the underlying objective conditions so that we know what the situation is, and then we can perhaps draw some lessons about the trends that are going forward. And I argue in this, the trends are that the world capitalist economy is not coming out of this pandemic quickly. It's going to come out weaker, less able to deal with the major long-term challenges which you've talked about, like climate change, rising inequality, the environmental destruction, and so on. In that situation, can Labour respond and take the opportunity of changing things for the better? Well, all I could say is I think that what most people, I'm not talking about politically active people, but most people in the world have recognized that you do need public systems which protect us from dying and getting ill. We need proper health systems, proper education systems, and so on. These aspects are powerful campaigning factors for any socialist and labour movement activist to concentrate on supporting and directing, because out of that will come people who will move to try and improve things. When people try to improve things, whether they are try to maintain what they had before through strike action or through political campaigns, whether it's over working conditions or whether it's over public services, then you get the reaction from governments. And that is when the class struggle intensifies and you can see the possibility for change, maybe defeat, but certainly possibility for change. So I would say, if I was looking over the next 5 years, I would say that we're going to see an intensification of the class struggle along these lines. Whether it's successful or not remains to be seen. If I knew that, the way forward, then we could quickly work to achieve that. But through discussions like this, hopefully we'll at least have a direction. That's what I've learned from the COVID thing. That public services, public health, public education, these things are powerful, positive ideas in the minds of the vast majority of people, and we can get a lot of support in the direction of changing society by campaigning on these things.
Yes.
I have a question, but Lisa has a question, so let's go to her. Then
Lisa. Yeah.
Lisa, you have to unmute your microphone.
Hi, everybody. So, I mean, I have a question because I'm in the United States. I'm in Burlington, Vermont. and I am an activist here. And so I hear a lot of contradiction with the Biden and Kamala situation, but then I feel conflicted because, can you hear me?
Yep,
Yes.
very much. I'm listening closely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm sure you know what's happening here in the United States.
Yep.
And so it's very conflicted because we do have to vote, because we cannot just not vote for Biden, even though we don't agree. And we do know, like you say, there's just two billionaires, you know, against each other. So it's voting for the lesser evil, because we all know that Trump is just, this is horrible, this situation. I've never seen anything like it, you know. So, well, my grandmother has, and my grandfather and my ancestors, but relatively, you know, taking away the 2008, 2009 recession, that was pretty bad. So, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I'm listening. Somebody else is speaking now.
Oh, okay.
Right.
So anyways, and we know that capitalism isn't working. Everyone knows that. But you know, how can we as individuals, one of the questions is, how can we as individuals begin to move and create change, you know? And another thing, what is your advice in this Biden Trump? Because I have to vote. We can't, you know, I'm trying to get everyone to vote, because otherwise Trump is going to win, and that cannot happen. So what do you think? What is the right thing to do? And how can we as individuals start turning this around? You know, do we continue to protest? What do we do? Do we just not vote for anybody? What do we do? Thank you.
It's I have to say that most elections, both presidential and congressional elections, for me in the past, although I'm not an American, have been easy to follow. It didn't make much difference who you voted for. You still got basically the same policy. But in this election, it's so much more difficult, isn't it? Because we have now experienced the American bourgeois have gone so far as to allow the election of a lunatic into power, allow totally corrupt and reactionary administration, and the bourgeois have gone along with this. First of all, they thought they could control Trump, and they would keep him under control. They didn't expect him to win. Trump didn't expect to win, but because Clinton was so useless, and because the electoral system is biased, so that although Clinton got 4 million more votes, because of the way the states break it up in the electoral college, she didn't win, which doesn't happen very often. It's very rare. The last time was when Gore got more votes than Bush and lost. But so it was a weird result. The bourgeois found they had a lunatic as a president. They thought they could keep control of him because he was so dumb and stupid, but he is not controllable. It clearly is not controllable. And he built a whole sycophantic group of hedge fund managers and reactionaries around him sitting in the White House who run the show and started replacing everybody in a reactionary way. And a lot of the bourgeois have now gone along with this because they fear that the alternative could be something that will damage their profits in the future and change the situation for them in an irreversible way. So it's very difficult to say to somebody this time, it doesn't matter if you vote for the Democrats or the Republicans in this election, because you're still going to end up tweedledum, tweedledee with the same capitalist leadership. Well, that's true. I think it is true that you will end up with the same capitalist, pro-capitalist leadership, but I suppose you might well end up with people who aren't quite so determined to destroy what basic rights the Americans have got left. So you could argue that voting for the Democrats this time is a vote for sustaining what rights Americans do have at the moment against Trump, who will move to reduce those even further if he wins the election. But all I would say is that I think you probably have to look at the ground locally where you are and make that decision. And as a socialist, I find it very difficult to say you should vote for one or other of the capitalist parties. But in this situation, it's very difficult to see how you could say, well, that means if Trump gets in, that's what you've done. I can understand that argument. I think it's a big debate in the movement. Yet within your movement, you will probably know better than me how people see that issue in the course of the period. But I think you pose the dilemma well. I'm right with you on this dilemma. I find it difficult to say how we're going to do that. What do we do to fight? Well, there are a lot of protests going on in the States now, whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's on other issues as well. The big issues are going to be preserving people's job conditions at a local level. People are going to struggle in their workplaces to preserve the conditions. There's going to be movements there. We need to work insofar as a union is decent, to work with unions to achieve that. There's going to be local campaigns on all sorts of issues, rent evictions and so on. There's a whole range of issues opening up for working people from which we can participate as socialists and try to take the movement forward. And as I say, on the political front, we need to, even if the Democrats aren't going to fight for it, then we need to find political organizations that do fight for single care health system paid by the public, education systems that are not broken up and destroyed as they have been, ending the privatization of these things and the segregation of them along racial lines. There are lots of programs that we would obviously support, and organizations, even if they're small, which can fight for that. So those are the areas that I think we've got a lot of areas we can fight on, and the programs we can fight on. The actual electoral issue, which is just in November, and then that's it, is a difficult one to make a decision on, but it's not important. You can't ignore it. And my feeling would be, if the situation is that, I suppose, I don't know what anybody else thinks on this show, but do we think that if Trump wins, it's worse than if Biden wins? For working people, I mean. And I think you'd have to say, look, sitting here as of the middle of August, yes, it would be worse if Trump wins again. And that makes you think about, you're forced into the position of at least getting rid of him, even if you don't expect anything else to improve.
Comrade Goodman, do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, that'd be good to hear. Am I talking rubbish?
There we go. No, you're not talking rubbish. It's quandary that millions and millions of people are in. They don't like Biden. They don't like Kamala Harris. Both of them are quote unquote establishment Democrats. But the party that I'm in, Socialist Action, our view is that both parties are equally to blame for what's going on. Both parties have gone along with a war budget and have not been mobilizing against Trump and his insane policies. Find bankruptcy in both parties, and it's not a question of the leaders individually, it's a question of the class basis of both of those parties.
Yeah.
See, just to try to make it brief, independent mobilization in the streets, strike action against what's going on to bring some justice, strike action where it's possible against the racial brutalities of the police departments across the country. And the repression now was under Obama as well, the crushing of Occupy Street. So we think there's a crisis of leadership historically across the world, not merely in the United States. We are for building a revolutionary party that participates in mass movements that are democratic, but keeps the notion of Lenin's theory of state and revolution. The state must be smashed, and that's the only way out of this crisis. There are no solutions under capitalism. And I wonder if maybe you could give your opinion on Lenin's ideas, the Bolshevik ideas, which to us still carry a lot of weight and are still true. We see this all over the world where so-called socialist parties end up supporting capitalist parties. No more true in Sri Lanka than anywhere else where you've seen this tragedy. So your view on Lenin and the parties of revolution?
Big question. Obviously, well, I think Lenin's position, as I understood it, was that we have a strategy that we want the working class to carry through socialist change to achieve a workers' economy and state which moves towards socialism international. That was the position of Lenin, Bolsheviks, and the Marxists of the Second International up until the First World War. So it wasn't just a Bolshevik thing, that only socialism internationally can really change society. But we have to start where we start, which is in each country where we are, and we have to campaign. And we have to do that through, we believe in that there is two classes primarily, the ruling class, the 0.1% or the 1% and everybody else, and the proletariat, the core of that working class exists in every country. In fact, it's got bigger in every country altogether in numbers, and that this is the basis for change, that working class is the agency for change, and therefore it's the aim and direction of socialists to work in working class movements to try and bring about that change, to raise the consciousness of working class people, that they need to, it's not just enough to fight for the conditions they have now, and that's bad enough, but to actually bring about a irreversible change so that we don't have to go through this nightmare on a permanent basis. So that is the basis of what we have to do. But then we come down to strategy and tactics. What's the right thing to do in this situation or in that situation which furthers that general aim? There's quite an argument, and you can have big differences within the socialist and labor movement about what is the right policy here, what is the right strategy here in this situation. That leads to generally all kinds of quite severe arguments, and did in the internationals themselves, and still does today. And the argument now, coming down to the nitty-gritty at this point, should you vote for a Democratic candidate in your constituency or state in order to defeat Trump or not? We can make the general point that both are capitalist parties, both have proceeded to reserve capitalism, that under the last Democratic president, we had repressive policies as well, but particularly all the homeland security stuff and all the rest of it, drones around the world, the wars and so on. There's no difference between the Obama presidency in that sense. In some way, Trump's done less than that under his presidency. On the other hand, we have a president now who encourages police violence, and encourages a section of the population to go out in guns and shoot people who are protesting, going around threatening them, all kinds of things like that, totally corrupt and all the rest of it. So it's a frightening difficulty for working class people to decide on November the 3rd, is it, whether they should vote for their local Democrat candidate and the presidency, a Democratic president or not. Probably the answer is that if Trump's defeated, we'll all breathe a sigh of relief and then realize it doesn't make a lot of difference.
Okay. Ridley?
Yeah, Michael, right. Now, I'm not too sure whether when you talk about working class today, which working class? You know, the working class today, as far as I know, is not the national or the English working class. Now, the Labour Party lost the elections, and the Red Wall collapsed.
Yeah.
Right. Now, what is the working class today? It's largely, I think, it's a migrant working class. So where do the Labour stand on the migrant working class, and which is largely non-English, migrants from various other countries, right? And I'm not too sure whether it's Labour. I don't know whether you are a Labour supporter or not. But
yeah,
this, I think, has been a a problem within the labor movement. It has been largely focused on the English working class, traditional working class. But the working class is no more traditional working class. It is migrant. So, and that working class is largely disorganized. And that's the working class that is being exploited today in the UK, right? And also you have the largely working class concentrated in China, in manufacturing industries. So it's dispersed, globalized, and largely migrant in UK and in the USA. So how do you address the situation? How do you conceptualize the working class today globally?
Okay, well, let me put it this way to you, Redley. Internationally, the working class has never been bigger. What do I mean by that? Well, Marx defined the working class, Marx and Engels defined the working class as anybody who has to work for a living to survive. Yes, some of us have a bit of savings, some of us might even have, I don't know, interest in the bank from their savings and so on. So they get money without having to work. But we can't live on that. 95% of the population, including quite well, what we regard as quite well-off people, have to work in order to get a living for the rest of the family if they're not working as well. Only a very tiny proportion of people actually live and have a great life without doing any work at all, just through dividends, profits, interest, and capital gains, speculating on the stock market. But having said that, that would imply, okay, so 99% of people are working class. Well, that doesn't sound very realistic, because we know that the vast majority of that 90% don't believe they're working class. A sizable section consider themselves part of the upper class, or better off people, and don't like to be associated perhaps with working people. And as you say, right down the bottom are people like migrant workers who are really at the bottom of the ladder, as it were, in terms of income, conditions, rights, and all the rest of it, assuming they can even get migration, because of course countries are trying to block them coming into different countries. But it's just been the history of capitalism and working class. The working class has always been broken up by capitalism. If you read Marx's works in the 19th century, he talks about how the Irish migrant workers were so heavily exploited and treated like dirt by the population at large, but particularly by the capitalist class. And yet, there was still some solidarity between the Irish workers and the English workers through the trade union movement. But the working class internationally has never been bigger. A lot of it is not in the old capitalist economies of the West. It's in places like India, Sri Lanka, and China. It's not in the UK. But even in the UK, we have a working class still. We still have millions of people who have to go to work. A small section of them are unionized and consider themselves that they're a class, that they need to work together. Large section of them don't. So when it comes to elections, they're open to all kinds of possibilities, as they are in America, to vote for reactionary governments and so on. I won't go into the history of why Labour lost the election in December 2019, but the main reason was not actually to do with any class issue. It was to do with the issue of whether Britain should be outside the European Union, which was a totally nationalist and reactionary issue, which the bourgeois was able to make as very important. We can go into why a section of the working class was prepared to support that policy rather than unite together to elect a Labour government, but that's an issue for another day, perhaps. What I would say, Redley, in finishing, is that the working class is still a force and the agency for change, and it's not true that migrant workers are the only force within that class for change. I still believe that a sizable section of other working people, indigenous working class people, white, black, and of different nationalities, and most countries are like that now, are forces for change and can unify on issues if those issues draw them together into one class action. And they do on many occasions. So I still have a great belief that the nature of the class struggle as outlined by Marx and Engels originally and by the internationals is still the basis for how we can bring about socialist change. if we were to rely alone upon migrant workers, then we'll never win, because they will always be the minority and they'll always be in the weakest position. We need unity of the whole class, both male, female, young and old, white and black, and migrant and non-migrant.
Okay, Kalpa, you have one.
Yeah, I have a rather different question, a methodological, a theoretical question. Thank you very much, Professor, for the great presentation and the discussion. It's very ironic for me that you used Joseph Schumpeter's ideas and the way you compared the ideas of Karl Marx with Joseph Schumpeter, because back in 2008, maybe Professor Sri can remember that someone mentioned that the answer for the 2008 recession was lied in Joseph Schumpeter's ideas, and the capitalism will actually gain its capacity and it will recover. But it's pretty clear right now at this critical juncture that the capitalism will recover its capacity on the dead bodies of working class people and the nature. It's pretty clear. But my question for Michael today is right now is that what kind of strength that you actually gained out of using Marx's methodology, using dialectics rather than using the conventional economic methodology?
Well, Calper, it's a big question. Actually, I mean, those who read my blog, I don't know, if you haven't, you should have a look. The purpose of my blog is concentrating on economics, not historical materialism of the whole panorama of Marxist ideas, or on how revolutionary strategy can be outlined. Often on my blog, I will say, this is the terrible situation in this economy. And I will get people come to me and say, okay, well, thanks very much, Michael Roberts, but how are we going to change it? Well, I often don't know the answer to that question. What I want to do is educate myself and other people about the state of the economy first. So that's what my blog does. That only has a limited role, I agree. You need to go further than that than just look at the economy. You need to, what policies and action you need to take to do something about it. But so what I would say is that given that's what my purpose in the blog, what I do is criticize particularly the logic theory of bourgeois economics, which is what Marx and Engels did in the 19th century when they looked at the bourgeois economics. Capital, which is Marx's most famous book, spread over several volumes and hard reading for most people, has a subtitle which was Critique of Political Economy. So Marx says, I'm not just criticizing or explaining capitalism, I'm criticizing what the capitalist economists think is capitalism and how that works. And that's what I think I'm trying to do in the blog, to look at that. So if you can call that a dialectical process, you can call it a critique of bourgeois economics, both what is called neoclassical economics, which is that markets work perfectly, and Keynesian economics, which the argument of the Keynesians, or Keynes, was, well, markets don't always work properly all the time, but with a few technical adjustments, we can make the market work properly. I want to dispute and critique and crush both of those ideas, and out of that, people will get a dialectical understanding of that negative approach to a positive alternative that you need actually to replace capitalism if you're really going to achieve a harmonious development of the economy. So that's my sort of answer to your question, in that my blog attempts to do that. If you can call that a dialectical process, well, I'd be very thankful for that compliment, but it's certainly a critique of what's going on in.
Yeah, personally, I'm a continuous reader of your blog for like last 3 years, so I'm totally aware that your methodology, and I recommend all the participants to read his blog. It's next recession. I can actually share the link right now with all of you.
May I ask one question? Michael, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Well, this is actually relevant to small economies in the global south. Well, I take the Sri Lankan case as an example. Now, with COVID, 3 main sources of income that Sri Lanka get in the last 10, 15 years, we lost those things. One is migrant workers, nearly $5 billion. Then the tourism, income from tourism. The third, income from exporting garment or apparel. Now all three we lost. Now the present government, if it suggests that we should adopt a more inward-looking economic policy in order to counter this situation, would it be a solution to this crisis, according to your views? Is it clear?
Well, you pointed out that can you repeat exactly the three things you think that Sri Lankan economy is founded on?
Income from migrant workers. We have a lot of workers working in the Middle East. So we lost that.
Yeah.
Tourism.
Yeah.
Income from tourism. Because we don't get. The third is exporting garment and apparels.
All right.
Countries. So all three we lost. So we can't depend on them. Or in other words, Sri Lanka is forced not to depend on them.
Yeah.
So if the government adopt some kind of inward-looking economic policies, like import substitution, kind of that, will it be a solution to at least to come out of this crisis?
Well, you're right. So just to explain, I'll repeat your argument that remittances, which is money coming back from Sri Lankans who are working abroad, usually in the Middle East, Pakistanis are doing that, Bangladeshis are doing that, Filipinos are doing that all over the world. This is an important source of income, and it is dramatically dropped during the COVID, as we know. And this is a disaster, not only for the people working abroad, but for their families at home when that comes back, and also for the general economy in places like Sri Lanka. And then, as I mentioned before, and you pointed out, the tourism industry has been savagely smashed by the COVID and the pandemic lockdowns in lots of countries, and Sri Lanka depends a lot. I haven't got a percentage of the economy that tourism is, but didn't have a chance to look that up, and I'm sure it's important enough to make a serious difference to the economy. I didn't know about the diamond exports and the precious jewels exports, but I can see that that can play a role. But if you think about those three items are clearly not enough to take any economy forward indefinitely, unless there is a basis of new industries that are got some technological base, can use the human capital, which is a horrible word, capitalist word, sorry, the human resources that of the Sri Lankan people, particularly those who, and to develop their skills, you need to raise the education levels and skills of the people so that they can participate in the new technological industries. And then, like India has a layer of that, that's something that Sri Lankans should possibly be able to expand and to move into areas where there is a possibility for expansion of exports. But you'd have to say, I mean, I don't know what you think, but Tsunami, that Sri Lanka is a small island. The idea that it can be a successful independent economy, Singapore style, seems to me unlikely. That it really needs, that we really need to see a transformation of the economy on a socialist basis within a Southern Asian socialist economy, within India, Bangladesh, and other countries in a federation. So Sri Lanka should be part of that, really. That's the only way that it's going to be transformed on an effective and sustainable basis. In the meantime, I agree with you. You need to be, what a government needs to be doing is devoting all its resources to developing state investment in new industries, new technology, educating the skills of the workforce so that it can do that, so that you don't have to rely upon sending hundreds of thousands of Sri Lankans abroad to work in shocking conditions in order to send money back to their families, or to rely upon the vagaries of Western tourists coming to Sri Lanka for a holiday for a few weeks. That is not how the 22 million people of Sri Lanka are ever going to have a prosperous life. You need to develop the resources and the skills of workers through industrialization process and new technology. That means massive state investment. I don't know what the state investment ratio in Sri Lanka is, but it'll be very, very low, 1 or 2% of GDP, if that. Any economy now that doesn't have a state investment basis of 20% of GDP, particularly in this crisis, going nowhere. You can see the dramatic transfer of resources that are required to achieve that, which means taxing the rich, stopping military spending, using that money to devote towards productive areas for the state to grow and to expand the education system. Of course, your present government has no intention of doing any of those things, quite the opposite. So you can only expect years more of difficulties for the people ahead.
We have another 6 minutes left. So if you have any questions?
I can hear a dog.
No?
If no one else is going to ask a question,
I think the dog's made the point there, Simani.
Ridley, ask another question.
Right. This is Michael about Marx. As far as I remember, you heard about Vera Zasulich, with whom Marx had correspondence. Vera Zasulich in Russia during the Narod movement, and there was a discussion between Marx and Vera Zasulich about non-capitalist form of development in countries like Russia, sort of agricultural based, and where Marx apparently agreed that Russia could perhaps use the commune form of to socialism, non-capitalist, so not going through capitalism as right. So in my question is, would you say that countries like Sri Lanka, could perhaps pursue this alternative way of not going through a capitalist form of development to reach social? This is the question, I'm sort of struggling with. What is your opinion?
Well, I think what I say, Redley, is that Sri Lanka is already capitalist. It's a weak capitalist economy dominated by imperialist powers in the foreign investment and so on, and also by its close big neighbor, India. So we already have a capitalist economy in Sri Lanka. What I think is correct, though, from the point you're making, is that the only way that Sri Lanka is going to develop for its people is to move to a socialist economy, which by that I mean that we have to take over the imperialist combines that exist in Sri Lanka and the local capitalists. We need to expropriate the local capitalists and the capitalist agriculturalists as well, and introduce a planned economy under the control of democracy and control of Sri Lankan people, and in order to expand the economy on the basis of state planning and investment. But Sri Lanka, as I said to Simani and to the rest of you earlier, Sri Lanka is a very small island. It's a small economy. It needs to integrate into a socialist federation with its bigger neighbours as part of the process of sharing those resources. So if the Sri Lankan workers ever came to power and were able to do that and expropriate capitalism in agriculture and industry and imperialism, then they could only survive by spreading that struggle into India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. Because if Sri Lanka stays on its own, surrounded by these other big capitalist powers who will attempt to crush it, then it's going to be a very tough time for Sri Lanka to survive. You could say, well, Cuba did it. It's just a smaller Sri Lanka, but that was a situation where it had massive support for a period of time by the Soviet Union. It was prepared to buttress Cuba up rather than let it sink. Where you could say, well, maybe China will help Sri Lanka. Well, that's a possibility that China would be able to support Sri Lanka as it went through such a revolutionary change. But eventually, the only real solution will be a socialist federation of Southern Asia.
Right. Okay, we'll stop here. And I thank Mike once again for accepting our invitation to this first English online Marx school. And we may meet again on 29th, our usual singular Marx school. And topic is New Trends in Heterodox Economics by Dr. Vagisha Gunasekara. She's a lecturer in the Open University in Sri Lanka.
Right.
And most probably next month, mid next month, we will have another English online Marx school. Okay, then until then, I once again thank Mike for your excellent presentation.
Well, thank you everybody for inviting me to speak at an international seminar that certainly was all over the world.
Help us to
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Today
Thank
we
you.
have a number of
Thank you,
people
Michael.
from other countries. So our intention is to have kind of a socialist federation of South Asian countries. So that's why we invited some of the people from India, Bangladesh, Philippines, and many other countries.
Yeah.
With that note, I will once again thanking Mike and all of you. I will stop today's session. Thank you.
And keep safe.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Oh, Goodman, Comrade Good, you have, we have here Secretary of the Sri Lankan section of the 4th International, but yeah, Mr. Neil Vijaytilaka, Comrade Neil Vijaytilaka.
I'm sorry, there's some noise
Yeah,
on
bye.
the computer.
Yeah.
Say again.
We have Sri Lankan section of the 4th International here, the secretary here, one Comrade Neil Vijaytilaka.
Okay.
And also Comrade Lankapeli is also here.
Okay, I'm looking for.
So you can sort of develop contacts with them.
Well,
Okay, bye.
What is your contact address? Perhaps I can.
I can talk to Marty and get the contacts, and
we will send them.
Yeah,
we will send it to you. Alpa will send it to you.
And we talk soon.
Yeah.